a best friend and you're out on the town and you happen to get into an altercation, and that best friend doesn't have your back and instead says, "Peace out, dude, I'm out." Is that really a best friend? Is it really even a friend at all? Well, it actually is it's an example of the relationship that some of our worst enemies have, I think, with each other. At the very least, what the Iranian war is doing is showing us what our enemies are capable of, and turns out it might not be much, which is great for us. But before we get into that deep dive, tpt@tpusa.com is the email address. We actually got an email the other day asking how fast I think I can say tpt@tpusa.com. Actually, that might have been it. Whatever the Kalshi markets say around that fast, whatever. Somebody time that and let me know. tpt@tpusa.com is the email address. And remember, if your emails are disgusting, vile, bigoted in all nature, we actually have a better chance of reading it on the show because that's exactly the type of thing that we go for around here, or at least that's what we've been called. So tpt@tpusa.com is that email address. I'd love to hear your thoughts about all of the things going on, even if we don't talk about it specifically on this show. Like today, we're probably not going to get too much of what's going on at DHS, but if you have opinions, tpt@tpusa.com, especially if you have opinions on how this global network of enemies and alliances is working out that we're about to discuss right now. To Iran. Iran's partnership with China and also Russia has been known as an axis of convenience. People who are not friendly to that alliance sometimes call it an axis of evil, which is accurate. Sometimes I even call it an axis of a-holes. But the whole access that they have between Iran, China, and Russia is built on this shared anti-US interest. But it's actually not really as much of an alliance as people might think. The commitments aren't really that committing. The relationship, honestly, on paper, with all of the treaties that have been signed, it looks impressive. But repeatedly, over and over and over again, it shows a lot of hard limits when there's actual real crisis, when the poo hits the fan. And how does that compare to the US and our allies, especially with regards to readiness and capability? Now, before we actually get into all of that, on the topic of readiness and capability, I have to show you a brief example of our actual real-life capability. This is a video a couple days ago of the US sinking an Iranian ship with a torpedo, which is something we haven't done since World War II. And honest to God, this might be the most amazing thing I've ever seen. Cut 11.
An American submarine sunk an Iranian warship that thought it was safe in international waters. Instead, it was sunk by a torpedo. Quiet death. The first sinking of an enemy ship by a torpedo since World War II. Like in that war, back when we were still the War Department, we are fighting to win.
Yes. Does anybody else have just that, like, internal, hell yeah? Like, as far as capability goes, that video, at the very, very least, at least says, we still got it. But exactly what are we up against on the global stage as it relates to Iran and the axis of a-holes? It's Chinese relationship, it's Russian relationship, all of the three in relationship with each other. What have we learned with the attack on Iran about our biggest enemies? Actually, quite a lot. See, Iran looks east as its strategy leans on long-term deals that, I guess on paper, signal durability. In January of 2025, Iran and Russia signed a 20-year comprehensive strategic partnership treaty. In other words, it's I got your back, bro. But do they really? Putin is obviously in Ukraine, and he's trying to deal with a bunch of sanctions, and Iran is, according to this treaty, going to help supply him throughout any of his acts of conquest. But what's interesting is the Russia deal with Iran highlights a lacking mutual defense clause, which limits what Iran can expect realistically from their partner and friend Russia, especially during wartime. The China agreement is described as involving up to $400 billion in investment, which obviously is concentrated a lot in oil and infrastructure. So Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing have all tried to project this united anti-United States front. Except for in January of this year, the three countries, in January of this year, the three countries signed a trilateral strategic pact where Iran sought advanced weapons systems and systems to modernize and deter their air defenses. Russia is cited as supplying S-400 air defenses and Su-35 fighters to Iran. China is cited as providing HQ-9B missiles and Bedlao-3 navigation technology. I don't think I'm pronouncing that correct at all, but who cares? Now, why would the top leaders be meeting above ground in Iran if they have all of these brand new weapon systems? Because remember, they've signed trilateral agreements. They've signed agreements with Russia and China to basically get all of the weapons they need to self-guard themselves. So there you have it. That's why the Iranian leaders were meeting above ground on February 28th. They thought it was safe. They have all of these defensives. The problem is none of it worked. Over the last week, the Chinese HQ-9B and Russian S-300 Tor systems completely crumbled against U.S. F-35 strikes and long-range anti-ship missiles. 0 intercepts were reported, and the entire system, really, that Iran had purchased from both China and Russia was entirely unstable under the electronic warfare that the United States was putting against them. There were failures in detection, interrogation, and the reliability of these devices were massively exposed. In other words, they didn't work, which is, interestingly enough, the second time this has happened in Iran. Remember, in June, Operation Midnight Hammer took out the Fordo and a bunch of other installations in Iran. And guess what? The systems that they bought from Russia and China didn't work then either. Also, this is the second time this happened this year. Earlier this year, obviously, you remember the raid on Venezuela, where Chinese JW-27A radars and Russian S-300 S-1 systems failed entirely to detect U.S. forces during Maduro's capture. Because remember, as a part of this axis of a-holes, Venezuela is also included, but also kind of like a tiny little kid brother. But they had Chinese resources too. They had Chinese military technology and equipment that also didn't work. Experts who have commented about this have cited inactivity, mainly incompetence, and deliberate neglect from the Chinese and the Russians. During the Venezuela raid, U.S. Delta forces faced almost no major resistance from Beijing and from Moscow, these supposed allies. And in regards to the race for dominance between the United States and China, it really is showing that, well, China's not doing a great job. Yes, are they a massive economy? Yes. Are they a big country full of, 1.3 billion people? Yeah. And are they willing to do things that the United States won't? Yes. But are all those things even possible? In other words, are they competent? The United States has treaties and alliances and just generally things that are based on actual value. If the United States says something, more than likely we will follow through on that promise. We have reliable free trade, which has led to innovation in leadership and also military supplies. The United States, sales-wise, does almost 6 times the amount of military sales as China, and also our stuff has been proven in combat by us. So outside what you think about the war with Iran, what this also is a stress test for our biggest adversaries. And that stress test revealed what the relationship is actually worth between Iran, China, and Russia when shots are actually fired. Despite the rhetoric of no limits, we will defend our friends at any cost, Russia and China have offered 0 actual material military aid to Iran, even though they've been hit by the United States of America China's biggest enemy on the world stage. Instead, China and Russia have offered very stern verbal condemnations of the strike, which is basically like a communist version of what the UN would do. But we're not talking about the UN right now. Their support has been framed around this transactional, self-serving, here's what we're all going to benefit from this, when in reality, it's not actually protective, and it's really not actually productive. Each partner, by the way, has had their own excuse to avoid, a deeper entanglement. Russia obviously is the war going on in Ukraine, and say, well, this would reduce our capacity if we wanted to add another fight, which actually is a real reason. It's self-inflicted, but it is a real reason. China, on the other hand, has portrayed themselves as, hey, look, I know we're buddies, Iran, but we can't really have your back on this one. Now, a lot of us think it's because, well, they can't just tangibly, but they say, well, we're prioritizing economic stability, and we fear an economic fallout if this escalates anymore. Now, supposedly, between the axis of a-holes, military coordination does exist, but it may be more signaling when they don't actually come to anyone's aid during warfighting. Now, on top of that, all of that, there is the component of experience. The last time China was in a real military conflict was in 1979 during the invasion of Vietnam, which many categorize as a disastrous, punitive campaign, which honestly exposed China's People's Liberation Army for a bunch of the weaknesses that it has. It's kind of like what's happening today. Now, since then, they haven't really had any full-scale conflicts. There's been minor skirmishes in India, some even in Russia. But really, it shows limited experience compared to the United States, especially the United States post 9/11, which we've had lots of military operations since then. The inexperience questions China's actual ability in modern warfare, and that matters. Right? Like on a practical basis, look no further than Taiwan. The entire world knows China wants Taiwan. We also know that the entire world, the US specifically, is also extremely reliant on Taiwan's semi-chip conductor manufacturing. But the microchips, the question is, are they enough for the United States to fight a war with China over Taiwan? Now, the question is, I actually don't know. I mean, if you're asking it to AOC, the question is,
Would and should the U.S. actually commit U.S. troops to defend Taiwan if China were to move?
I think that this is such a, I think that this is this is, of course, a very long-standing.
The official position of the United States is strategic ambiguity. But further than that, I don't know. What do the people of the United States say? Are we willing to go to war with China over Taiwan? But interestingly enough, what the Iranian attack shows is that maybe we don't have to. It is possible that all of the exposure in the weakness of China's military capabilities and technology, evidenced by a ton of military failures in Iran, in Venezuela, might deter them entirely from invading Taiwan in the first place, at least, in the near future. Because obviously that's everybody's concern. If China moves on Taiwan in the next year, what do we do? And that is a very, very pressing question. But what this may have done is shown China that, maybe we're not even ready. And we also don't want to find out if the United States is going to come to the aid of Taiwan. Look, whether or not, you support the war in Iran or the direction, this has given us a ton of great insight into our biggest adversaries, which, will have global implications and will likely set up the United States for massive success on the world stage. Now, last thing, if you want to talk about democracy, despite the fact that libs keep calling President Trump a dictator and a tyrant. He's not. But the countries that we've been talking about, Iran, China, and Russia, do have dictators. It's not a small note, and it's actually very interesting to show that it seems like actual authoritarian dictatorship doesn't exactly work. It can look formidable, it can look big and tough and powerful and strong, but tends to fracture pretty deeply under real pressure, again, evidenced by the last couple months. But democracy and the freedom that has been built in the United States of America, I think clearly has proven to be much more reliable and battle-tested. Overall, like I've said a number of times, you can have your own opinions on Iran. You can have your own opinions on President Trump. Polling shows that most conservatives support President Trump and what he's doing in Iran. But at the very, very least, we can all accept the fact that this is great information, fantastic intel into what China's capabilities are. Unfortunately, whether you'd like to admit it or not, the idea of the Thucydides trap, where the two biggest superpowers almost always go to war with each other, is probably likely at some point in the future. But what it shows now is that China seems to be very far away from that being a realistic scenario, which would be good for the rest of the world. It is great to know all of these things about our biggest adversary, regardless of what you think about the actual war itself.